everybody. Welcome to week 11. Okay, so this is another one of those transition weeks where we're now about finished with poetry and we're moving on to drama. And I love this section because I love Hamlet. So I'm so excited to share this with you. If you've read Hamlet before, I hope you get something new out of it. I've read Hamlet over a dozen times, and every time I read it, I see something new that makes me laugh. Because Shakespeare is the master, and to appreciate him, takes a lot of effort. So even if you have read this before, a word to the wise, don't spoil it for your classmates, or they might digitally hurt you. So do not mess with them. Don't give things away. Just, come along on the journey with us. But first, we have to finish up poetry. So I put a video in here about scanning a poem. Some of you said that was kind of hard to do last week, so I wanted to throw that in there. Hopefully that's helpful to you to have just a little refresher on how to do that. Okay. There's a little test review, specifically what are some things you want to make sure you focus on for this poetry test. And then there are two parts to the poetry test. That is due Tuesday by midnight. That is a small window on purpose because that helps with test security, so people aren't sharing answers and stuff like that. So another thing happening is now it's time to work on your novel analysis paper, just like the short story paper. Only this time, we're doing it over a novel. Remember, you needed to choose one of the novels from the list. If you are having issues getting novels, let me know. A lot of libraries are posting their books online. There's also the emergency public library, essentially, that has opened. And so most of these books are available digitally if you don't have a paper copy. If you need help or we need to work something out about a novel, hopefully you already have it and have been working on it at this point. But if not, let me know. We'll see what we can do. Just some handouts on writing the novel analysis paper. I just want you to be thinking ahead to how am I going to make this a paper. Again, same thing as the short story paper. I will tell you there are some requirement differences. The length is a little bit longer for the actual paper. So make sure you flip through these directions. I've also put in some tips for writing the literary analysis paper, just things I saw from the short story paper. So make sure you're checking through those directions and scrolling past short story, now onto the novel section. So be sure to look at those. The thesis worksheet is due next Monday. So make sure that you're ready to turn that in. You will actually turn that in the week 12 folder, but I wanted to go ahead and give you the worksheet so that you can fill it out and have it ready to go. Okay. So once you've kind of thought about your novel and what direction you're going there, again, that worksheet will look exactly the same because this is the exact same kind of paper, just with a novel instead of a short story. And you take your poetry test, you study and take that poetry test by Tuesday, be working on your novel. The big thing we're starting is Hamlet drama. So I hope you enjoyed this. We will go back to quizzes. So this week we're going to do Act 1. So make sure that you jump in there, and I need to fix that date, but I have put a lot of resources. You will find that I will dump a ton of resources in there to help you through Hamlet. I'll put stuff in the discussion board. I'll put stuff in the assignment folder because I understand that Hamlet can be hard to read. So I remember this is a play. It was meant to be viewed. So I found movie clips, of course, from the Mel Gibson version of Hamlet because it's the best. So I've included some clips from the Mel Gibson version of Hamlet, some of the key scenes that I hope is helpful to you. Also, I have included an audiobook that has a dramatic reading of Act 1, and I will put these in there for all of the acts. So if you'd rather just listen to it, feel free to do that. Okay. So lots of help along the way. Use what you need to help you get through this. Okay. So review and take the poetry test. Be ready to do your novel analysis because that planning worksheet where you just kind of plan out, here's what your thesis is going to be, here's sort of the direction I'm going. That will be due next week. But the big thing is going to Hamlet. So here are the lecture notes about Hamlet. Okay, first let's talk about drama in general. Okay, so we have to talk about the difference between drama and prose and poetry, because those are different things. And we're going to talk about the elements of drama. So first of all, prose is fiction and nonfiction. Okay, so you have a narrator, a plot, characters, setting. So that was our short story section. Okay, it's meant to be read, usually to yourself. Narrators drive those stories, and usually we can kind of hear the author in those stories. Okay, so that's prose. One specific type of prose that is kind of interesting is the novel. So we don't even actually use the word novel to the end of the 18th century, so that's the 1700s. It actually is from the Italian word novella, so a realistic tale. This comes from the medieval period, okay? The reason that the novel comes about is because of industry. People have more free time, and so they want things to do. And so there is public demand for longer stories. Instead of just short stories, we want long stories, okay? And they have the money now because of industry. So we get circulating libraries. Of course, we get new printing techniques that help make the novel faster and cheaper to print. We already had some sort of novels out there. We had some autobiography and biography. People published their journals and diaries. So we already kind of had that nonfiction novel. But really when we get the fiction novel is the English come up with this. They tend to be associated with the middle class, with morality. The real full English novel was called Pamela by Samuel Richardson. It was published in 1742, so not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. We don't really get an American novel, though, until the 1840s. Here we get some Hawthorne, Melville, Cooper, bring the novel to America. Okay, but really it's because of industry. People have more money, more free time, and they want something longer to read. So that's when we get the novel. Okay, so the difference is the novel deals with a human character typically in a social situation. It has a lot more emphasis on character. You'll notice for short stories, most of our characters didn't have a great amount of development. Whereas a novel, we have all this time to really learn who our characters are. Okay. And early novels were very realistic. They were sort of like what life was really like. And so the novel has a couple of things that make it different than the short story. Usually it has very plausible plot structure, although I will say now that we've added in things like science fiction, fantasy, those are very new. Genres. And so, just the traditional classic novel typically is very plausible. Very believable characters. It feels very real, is what we look for in novels. Originally, we defined a novel as a work of prose over 50,000 words. Although it probably felt like some of the, short stories I asked you to read might have been that long. But, a novel, part of its definition is that it's just longer than a short story. All right, so then what about drama? Well, we can thank the Greeks for drama. You probably have heard this before. Originally, they were written as hymns to Dionysus, so this was part of god worship. In 534 BC, Thespis, which is where we get the word thespian, jumps on the back of the cart and acts as though he were a character. He was actually speaking lines of poetry, and he took the poetry, acted it out, and then we have drama. Okay. Aeschylus then added a second speaking role, so now we have two characters up on stage. And his play, The Persians, is the oldest play we actually have a copy of. And then Aristotle comes along, and he writes this great literary criticism called the Poetics, where he actually, then defined what drama really is. And he writes this basically literary theory of drama. So Aristotle sort of shapes, what drama is for us. Okay, so what is a drama? Well, there are different kinds. First is a comedy. They don't have to be funny, but they typically are satirical. And usually they mock people in power. So if you are familiar with something like the Babylon Bee, satire makes us laugh. Okay. A lot of times the reason we call them comedies is that they end happily. All right. So a wedding, party, but lots of satire, making fun of those in power. But we have two kinds of satire and comedy. We have high comedy, which was very like educated, deep thinkers, think like Big Bang Theory. And then we have like low comedy, body jokes, something like, Three Stooges. Okay. Satyr plays were the plays that were performed between tragedies because, it's exhausting to watch that much tragedy. And so these satyr plays would come between the acts and they would basically make fun of the characters. It was sort of a way to infuse some lightheartedness into the middle of these really dark stories. Tragedy, which is the one we're going to focus on because Hamlet is a tragedy, it deals with big themes. So love, loss, pride, those are the common ones. We typically have a main character protagonist that commits some terrible crime and doesn't realize how stupid it was. And as he realizes his error or reaps the consequences of his actions, the whole world starts to explode around him. So the three big playwrights were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And the reason it's tragedy is not because there's no funny parts, because there usually are. It's because the people die in the end. So I might have given away some of Hamlet, but I'm sure if you've studied Shakespeare before, that doesn't surprise you. Again, Aristotle argued that tragedy cleansed the heart by bringing this idea of catharsis. That it was a way for us to deal with the bad things in our life. And so that's what tragedy's role was in society, was to help us get that out, to, deal with our suffering. So I think that's a really interesting way to look at tragedy. History is another type, and typically comes under tragedy because let's face it, history can be tragic. And really the English, they're the pioneers of history plays. And this comes about in the Renaissance, mostly because of Shakespeare. He writes a lot of history plays about the Henrys. You've read King Lear, maybe. So they follow someone in power, and he does that with Richard, lots of kings. So Shakespeare, does a lot of history plays. Something to know about drama is that it's intended to be acted out. So when you're reading Hamlet, keep that in mind. In your mind, picture what this looks like on the stage because you're supposed to be watching it, okay? So there's a heavy emphasis on characters and dialogue. So there's typically not a narrator that's sort of telling us the things that they are doing. You just have to see it in your head and understand what they would be doing. The plot is driven by dialogue. So because we have characters and we can't actually see them, the plot for us, the reader, is through what they say. So as you're reading through, you really have to focus on what these characters are saying between each other because that's the story, right, is in their dialogue with each other. So the setting, typically for drama, is created through props, which of course you won't be able to see, so you'll just have to imagine those, and stage directions. So you will get sometimes in italics those stage directions at the beginning of acts so that you know. We get those instead of narrative. All right. Costumes and lighting and things like that would have helped them. But I'll be very honest, during Shakespeare's time, it was pretty slim. Also, women were not allowed to be part of plays. So all of the women's parts would be played by young boys whose voices hadn't changed yet. So keep that in mind. Maybe that's an interesting picture in your head. The queen in this play, Gertrude, would have been played by a young boy. Ophelia, same deal, because women were not allowed to be actors. So just, a little tidbit in there. Okay, so what's the difference between them? Drama has little to no narrative. Poetry has a persona. Fiction uses a narrator, right? So they all kind of use narrative differently. Drama gives a setting through the props. Poetry doesn't typically have a setting, and fiction has to have setting, right? We have to have somewhere this story happens. Fiction and drama have some structure. Poetry can be really structured or completely unstructured. All right, we talked about open and closed forms. Fiction and drama have plot and action. Poetry, not a lot of action. Okay, so they all use these elements very differently. And hopefully you see now that once we go through all three types, since we've done fiction, we've done poetry, now we're about to do drama, hopefully you can see the difference between all of these. So that's a little bit about drama. Now let's talk about Hamlet. Okay, so a little bit about Hamlet and a little bit about Shakespeare. So here's what you need to know to get you started. First of all, some things you probably know about Shakespeare. Lord willing, you've studied Shakespeare already some point before this class. So I'm going to assume you have a little bit of background on Shakespeare. He was born in Stratford upon Avon, which just means along the river Avon. He was an English playwright, and we call playwrights bards. Shakespeare is called the Bard, kind of like the Ohio State. Okay, so he's kind of a big deal. He wrote a bunch of stuff. Almost all of it is in iambic pentameter, which we saw with his sonnets. You're going to see that in Hamlet, almost all of his plays. Besides being these like great epic works with really complex characters in iambic pentameter, which is crazy. He wrote sonnets, he wrote tragedies, he wrote comedies, he wrote histories. If you've ever studied Midsummer Night's Dream, that was one of his famous comedies. One of his most famous histories are the Richards and the Henry series. Very prolific writing. He did own and run the Globe Theatre in London, and he was part of the King's Men Acting Company. So he was an actor. That's how he got started, and then eventually worked his way up and owned the Globe Theatre. Okay. So here's some things you may not know. We don't actually know when he was born. Traditionally, we celebrate his birthday on April 23rd. The reason is his baptism was on April 26th, and usually they would have baptized little babies between 2 and 3 days after they were born. So 1564 was his birthday. He did go to grammar school, but only attended till he was 13. That's it. All the schooling he had. Which is why sometimes people question whether Shakespeare is actually a real person, or maybe he is actually somebody else who might have been more educated. Then he just kind of disappears. We don't really know what happens to him for the first, 15 years or so. We do know in November of 1580, he marries a woman named Anne Hathaway. And by the way, this is not the actress from, movies that you're aware of. Different person. She is much older than Shakespeare. So she moves in with Will, and she moves in with Will's father, John. They have baby Susanna, and then they have twins, Hamnet and Judith. In 1596, Hamnet died, and Anne was completely heartbroken. Some because, of course, her baby died, but some also because William had been gone for years. He was in London. She was still in Stratford upon Avon, taking care of William's father, so her father-in-law. He was in London performing, writing plays, running the theater company, and she didn't want to live in London. Stratford is, much quieter, more country, and London was dirty and nasty, and of course the plague and all of those things, and so she didn't really want to live in London, but he had to, so a lot of people, kind of wonder about how things were with them. In 1592, Shakespeare becomes well known by then, but in 1593, the theaters close. There's a play afoot, and some people blame it on the theaters and sort of Their body lifestyle is divided by Cain. They close all the theaters. Sound familiar? You know, and so he takes his time to write. He writes an entire play while he's in isolation. The Earl of Southampton takes him on, and in April 1593, he publishes Venus and Adonis. So he writes an entire play while in quarantine. He is working with the Lord Chamberlain's men at the time. He performs before Queen Elizabeth. Lots of plays, including Romeo and Juliet, which you may be familiar with. In 1596, that's when Hamlet dies. Sadly, there is no record of Shakespeare attending that funeral, although he may have, but we don't have any record of that, or how much he actually came home to see his wife and kids. He actually bought the second largest house in London, so that tells you how well he was doing, because he wanted his family to come to London. However, his wife didn't want to come to London. She stayed for a little while, and then she left and went back to Stratford. He died in 1616, possibly from typhus. There were lots of, fevers and plagues and things like that. So we're not really sure what happened. He is buried in Holy Trinity Church. You can go see Shakespeare in Stratford with this inscription on his tomb, which I also have a picture of right here. This is the house that he bought in London. But here's what it says. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. So grave robbing was kind of a big deal, and he didn't want people to, steal his bones. So, all right, here's what you need to know about Hamlet specifically. So Hamlet is a teenage boy with a tough decision to make. One thing you need to know about Hamlet is he's a thinker. He struggles with life's big questions, and that's part of the reason why I love Hamlet. He struggles with these big ideas, like what is love, and what does it mean to be a child of parents, and what does it mean to rule over people, because he's a prince. And so what is the meaning of life, and what is really death, and what is revenge, and when is a wrong a right? And he just struggles with these huge issues, and he does them out loud for us to hear them. And hopefully you appreciate some of his perspectives on some of life's toughest questions, because Hamlet, Shakespeare through Hamlet, tries to sort of deal with life's big questions. He is a tragic hero. He's the protagonist of a tragedy. He evokes pity and fear from the audience, and so that makes him a tragic hero. We also have to see a reversal in his fortune from good to bad. That's peripeteia, right? Usually this reversal in fortune is because of a bad decision or pride. Also, his hamartia, or his inner quality, so some kind of like interpersonal trait, has to drive the character to make a decision that leads us to the horrible, dying that happens at the end. So it has to be the character's fault. The decisions the character makes has to lead to the tragic end. That's what makes them a tragic hero. So when I ask you, why is Hamlet a tragic hero? Or why is Hamlet a tragedy? Please don't tell me it's because all the people die. There are so many other things that have to happen to make this a tragedy. We have to have a tragic hero. There has to be peripeteia. There has to be some sort of inner quality of our character that leads to the downfall. And here's a key thing. The hero cannot deserve his fate. We actually have to feel sorry for him. If we don't like him, it is not tragedy. Honestly, then we feel satisfied, and that's almost comedy, okay? It has to be, he makes decisions because of his character, who he is, that leads to the downfall of everybody else. But we as the audience feel like he had no other choice. We can't see like, oh my gosh, this character's stupid. Why would he make this decision? We almost have to feel like it's the same decision we would make if we were them. Okay, so the character cannot deserve his fate. We cannot be happy that the character dies at the end. So we have to feel that he made the right decision with the information he had at the time, but it still leads to everybody dying. So keep all of those little details in mind. Be looking for those as we go through the play. Okay, so here's some things to look for. An aside is when the character speaks to him or herself, but there are still other people on stage. So he's like having a conversation, sort of thinking out loud to himself, even though there are other people on the stage. A monologue is when one character makes this really long speech and there are other characters on stage. That is different than a soliloquy, which is a really long speech, but nobody else is around. Solo, right? So make sure you get those clear in your head. A conceit is when we have an extended metaphor that has sort of a weird comparison that you never would have expected. Okay, we will see this a couple of times because Hamlet is big on that. An oxymoron is when we have two opposite terms combined. Be on the lookout for those because Hamlet loves puns and he loves oxymorons as a character, so be looking for those things. Staging are those nonverbal cues given by the writer. So that's sort of the narrative of the play, are those little staging notations. So be on the lookout for those because that will tell you that the day has changed or the location has changed. Also, one thing that's required for drama is there has to be unity of three things: time, place, and action. So a play should take place in a very short amount of time. Aristotle said 24 hours. I will tell you, Shakespeare doesn't stick to that, but that it needs to be compact. It needs to take place in the same location. So they should not move all over the place. And so you will see that too. And then action. So it needs to be comedy or it needs to be tragedy. Again, Shakespeare doesn't always stick to that. There's some comedy in this too. So I hope you find those. The point of view for plays is third dramatic, okay? Because we don't have a narrator at all. So dramatic is its own type of perspective. Okay, and then finally, just some overall things to keep track of. Remember, it's a tragedy, so look for those elements of tragedy, including tragic hero, tragic flaw, peripeteia, and does he deserve it? Okay, even though his choices are what lead to the tragedy, we have to feel sorry for him in the end. So look for those elements of drama, soliloquy, monologue, conceit, oxymoron, things like that. Also, here are some key themes I want you to keep track of in Hamlet. Decay and corruption. There's a lot of it. Revenge, huge. Appearance versus reality. This is one we're going to actually talk about in the discussion boards because so be watching for that. Sanity versus insanity, which kind of goes with that appearance versus reality. And then the search for truth and doing the right thing. This is what Hamlet struggles with. What is the right thing? And you almost want to tell him like what Frozen says, just do the next right thing. But he struggles with what is that right thing. And so I want you to think about, if you were in Hamlet's shoes, what would be the next right thing? Okay, so I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. I will help you through this as much as I can. Remember, you don't have to understand every word. You just have to get the overall gist. I'm not going to ask you about very minute details. Okay, if you have any questions, jump in the discussion board and ask me. Feel free to send me an email, and I will be happy to help you with that. Otherwise, I'll see you online, guys.